Thank you all for coming to our meeting tonight. These meetings provide us a valuable opportunity to get feedback from the community on the project that we are planning in order to continue to refine it to ultimately define the best route for the high-speed rail project to take. These meetings are specifically about the project section from Los Angeles to Anaheim, and in this case, obviously, we're talking about two. We're talking about Burbank to Los Angeles and Los Angeles to Anaheim. So they're really about the features of the project in that area and not set up to be about the program as a whole, although we will give you some information on the program. I'm waiting potentially for the slide deck to come up. Let me see if I can make that happen. I thank you for your patience. I apologize for that. So can I see a show of hands for anybody here who has never been to a high-speed rail meeting, who doesn't know anything about the high-speed rail project at all? We have one? Okay. I would love to talk with you a little bit afterwards. We will talk about some information, some program-wide information. If you don't get enough, please follow up with me at the end of the presentation. And again, here on the slide, you can see the 800-mile all-electric high-speed rail project that is planned for the state of California. In blue, that represents our Phase 1 system, which provides a critical north-south linkage across the state to the major metropolitan areas in the north and the south, San Francisco in the north, Los Angeles, Southern California, Anaheim in the south. And of course, the projects we're here to talk to you about today provide the end of that very, very critical 500-mile system. You can also see our Phase 2 project in the north from Merced to Sacramento, and in the south from Los Angeles to San Diego through the Inland Empire. Something that's interesting to think about with regards to this project is if you can imagine in your mind's eye a map, a heat map that shows the densest parts of California where the most people live in the state of California, and you put this map over the top of that, it perfectly matches where people in the state of California live. We are building a project by Californians for Californians to serve people where they live today. Sometimes down here in Los Angeles area, we forget that cities like Bakersfield and Fresno are among the top 10 by population in the state of California. So this is really meant to provide a critical linkage to the people, our residents of the state of California, by placing stations in the heart of the cities where they live, so that you can come to the urban center using many different modes of travel and get on a very fast, seamless train trip to anywhere else along this very important north-south route. Also very important, this is an electric train. This is renewable energy-based transportation for the state of California. And as a state with 800 miles of coastline that we'd like to keep, that's a really important feature that we're bringing online for the state for its future as well. When we do this project, we have to take a look at priorities, and we have to focus on little steps that help us ultimately deliver the project. And right now, our priorities are shown on this slide here. Number one, deliver the Silicon Valley to Central Valley line. We want to get high-speed electric trains operating in Southern California as soon as we possibly can. This is a type of transportation we don't have in the United States today. We have higher speed rail on the East Coast, for instance, but we don't have a fully modern high-speed rail system operating today. So we want to be able to get that operating as quickly as we can, and we've identified this route as the route that will allow us to do it. Number two, we got to keep working on delivering that entire route, the entire 500-mile connection between San Francisco and Anaheim. And one key step along the way is what we're doing here tonight, which is talking about the route selection, which then feeds into the environmental process and the completion of that phase of the work, so that at the end of this process, we can say, this is the route high-speed rail is going to take from Burbank to LA and LA to Anaheim. That is a very critical step for the other partner agencies that we coordinate with, and it's a very important step in the minds of the private sector. The private sector has an interest in these types of projects and could bring money to us, but they don't like to have that conversation until we can tell them what the route is. So that's what we're working towards today. And in the meantime, we've got to do some things so people can keep the faith, so you can see that we're continuing to move towards building high-speed rail. And so we have some money that we're investing here in Southern California in two specific places right now. We're investing in the Rosecrans-Marquardt grade separation, which is on the Los Angeles to Anaheim line. And then we are investing in the run-through tracks at LA Union Station, which of course is the juncture between Burbank to LA and LA to Anaheim. And in combination, these two projects unlock immediately, when they're completed, additional train service, additional Metrolink service, additional schedule offerings for our LOSSAN service as well. So the idea is to start building towards high-speed rail in this urban area as a puzzle. Pick some of the biggest, most important projects, complete them first in a way that will allow high-speed rail to use them someday, but in a way that immediately when they're done, they have a benefit to the operators who are using these corridors today. And so that's what we're working on. You know, we often get questions, all of you except for one person have been to our meetings before, so you probably know this, but we often get questions about whether or not the high-speed rail project is in construction. And the answer is yes, it is. We have 21 active construction sites in the Central Valley right now, with over 2,000 jobs having been created to help us with the construction of some of the major civil works for the project. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I was talking about those bookend projects, the Link Us project and the run-through tracks and the Rosecrans-Marquardt grade separation. But our project has two different characters in the Southern California section. From Bakersfield to Palmdale and Palmdale to Burbank, we have a pure high-speed rail system. Once we get to Burbank, from Burbank to Los Angeles and Los Angeles to Anaheim, the high-speed rail project is going to join the urban corridor that exists today. So we are looking at this as a shared urban corridor project. There are operators providing valuable service there right now today. We have our freight movement going on in this corridor. We have Metrolink service. We have Amtrak Surfliner service. We have Amtrak long distance service. And all of that is a benefit to mobility today. Within this corridor, we are planning to come in, modernize this corridor, and introduce high-speed rail service into the corridor while we preserve for, and in fact, deliver things that will allow Metrolink service to improve over time, the Surfliner service to improve over time, and the goods movement to flow more efficiently. And so that has required, obviously, a lot of coordination with these other operators to date, and there's a lot more to do. But this is a way that the dollars invested in high-speed rail get to do more than one thing. It's not just a high-speed rail project anymore. Every dollar invested gives multiple dollars back in benefit. And so when we're looking at the urban area here in Southern California, and we're thinking about all of the rail service and the important things that that rail service does, we decided we'd put it all on a map so that we could, kind of get our arms around it a little bit. And so to orient you, you can see some dotted lines going along the coast. That's our LOSSAN Surfliner Amtrak service. That is the second busiest Amtrak line in the country. You can see the turquoise blue, the 3 lines, 3 routes coming in for the north. That's pure high-speed rail coming in from Bakersfield through Palmdale and into Burbank. And then you can see that disappears. You can't see that distinction anymore. At Burbank South, just what we were talking about, that's where the high-speed rail project joins a shared urban corridor. And now we're one of several operators within that corridor. And also importantly here, you can see in red out towards the right side, that is our national freight goods movement corridor. That is the corridor that takes the containers out of Port of Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles and takes them out across the country. And that's operating in these corridors as well, and we'd like them to be able to operate more efficiently, to get those containers out of the basin, get them to their final destination faster and more efficiently than they are today. And so we talked a little bit, or I mentioned the idea of modernizing the corridor, and here are some of those features of a modern corridor. I think most of you can imagine, the railroads have been around for a long time, and those rail corridors have existed for a long time. They were built in the 19th and 20th century, so we're going to give them a little 21st century makeover. What that means is we're going to take a look at those, and we are going to make sure that they have uniform corridor protection and fencing around the outside of the entire corridor, not just high-speed rail, that is electronic fencing so that we can tell if somebody is trying to climb over those fences and get in the corridor, because trains and people and animals and cars don't mix, and we should not have strikes in those corridors. Positive train control will, of course, operate in those corridors, so all trains know where all other trains are. We will also have an earthquake early warning system in that corridor that senses the first wave of an earthquake and shuts those trains down so that catastrophic injuries don't happen in these corridors. Those are things that we would expect a modern corridor to have. They also include signaling upgrades, modern signal systems so that we can run trains closer together than we can today, so that we can squeeze every last bit of value out of these corridors. So that's what we're talking about, a modern corridor. And I thanked you all for attending earlier, and I am very sincere in that. When you're trying to plan and ultimately build a project the size of the high-speed rail, it's a little bit complicated. And we need to figure out what the right project to build is. And the right project is a balance. And we show here, and those of you who've been to our meetings, we've talked about this before, those things that we're balancing in a very macro way. We have the project objectives. These are the things the train needs to do to meet its charge. It's got to be safe. It's got to be fast. We have to put stations where the most people will ride it, things of that nature. We have the environmental resources, which we have to protect, and we work with regulatory agencies all the time to talk about that. Here in the urban corridor, some of you might be thinking, that might not be as difficult as it is north of Burbank, but it is still very complex. We have a lot of water features here. We've got the LA River, we've got crossings and bridges across that, and we need to look at that very carefully and balance that as we plan the project. And then finally, we have the community, and we have to have these conversations with the community up and down so that we understand the character of the community and we are able to describe a project that allows that character to continue into the future. And so striking that balance is what we're trying to do when we determine when we identify the route the high-speed rail project will take. It does not mean the project is perfect in any of these areas. Again, it's a balance, and it's very, very difficult to do. In order to do that, of course, we do a lot of meetings like this. This is the 8th meeting like this that we've done in the last couple of weeks. So we've been in Bakersfield, right? We've been in Montebello, we've been in Tehachapi, we've been in Lancaster, we've been all over Southern California talking to folks, having a little bit of different conversations because we're talking about the project in their community, in each of these communities. But that's how we are able to make sure that the public is educated and we have a conversation with you about what we're planning to build ultimately. That is important. We will not be able to avoid every impact, but we can have a conversation, we can identify all of them and have a conversation with you about all of them, and that is our commitment. So, Burbank to Los Angeles, starting from the north. Our Burbank Airport Station will be a station located adjacent to the new terminal that the Hollywood Burbank Airport is planning to provide air rail connectivity for Southern California. We're also looking at the adjacent Metrolink stations to see how we bring all of that together into a package. Then we come up and join the existing rail corridor down to Los Angeles Union Station. This is the corridor the trains run in today. This is the corridor that would be modernized so that high-speed rail could enter service there. It's approximately 14 miles long, and of course bounded by the stations at both ends. Again, talking just a quick map, it is bounded by stations at both ends. All of our projects in the environmental documents have a station at each end. So if you look at the Burbank to Los Angeles document, ultimately, when it's released, you will see that it includes Burbank and LA Union Station. If you pick up the Los Angeles to Anaheim document, you will see it also includes Los Angeles Union Station, and then it includes Anaheim as the other end of the project. So at Burbank, do we want?
Up to you.
So at Burbank, you can see a little bit about, I kind of thought this would go different. Okay, come up. Sorry, I thought all of the introduction for Burbank to LA and LA to Anaheim would be in one section.
All right, so I'm going to step through in a little more detail from Burbank to LA and I think LA to Anaheim in the next couple of slides. Not exactly to the detail around the room today, but in more detail than the overview. So starting in Burbank, as Michelle mentioned, this is the area where we're transitioning from a dedicated high-speed rail system into more of the urban shared corridor. And just so you can follow along on the maps, the purple is the underground sections, green is at grade, and then blue will be aerial sections on bridge. So the Burbank station is underground. We are, joining with underground sections moving further from the north. And the station has been placed to best provide connectivity to the relocated terminal in Burbank. It also minimizes interface with the residential areas as we join in with the at-grade alignment moving south. Southerly from Glendale to Atwater, Again, we are in the existing corridor, and we are adding 2 electrified tracks to the 2 non-electrified tracks that exist today. So this does involve some shifting of the tracks so that we can maximize the right-of-way so all 4 tracks can fit. The majority of the rail corridor is within the existing right-of-way. We'll have some slides coming up that talk about the grade separations. Those are areas where we go outside of the right-of-way. There is a section within Glendale where the corridor is slightly elevated, not on structure, but on berm, so that we could minimize impact at some of the grade separations. And we also preserve the historic Glendale Metrolink station with our proposed project. Moving south into LA to LA Union Station, we do cross the LA River. We have maintained our alignment within the existing corridor so that we minimize impacts to the G2 parcel and the existing parks along this part of the alignment. We were very careful about those particular parcels. Also, we have a planned grade separation at Main Street where the road would cross over both rail and river. We've been coordinating with Metro. They're here with us today on the Link Union Station project. That's been a collaborative effort and brings us into Los Angeles along with all the other operators, also maximizing connectivity there. So I'll cover the grade separations for Burbank to LA. There are 6 roads that cross at grade. We are proposing to grade separate all of those. The ones that are at the location where we're raising slightly the corridor are the 3 in Glendale, the Sonora, Grandview, Flower grade separations. And we have a station screen as part of the open house where we get into a little more detail if you would like to focus in on those. And then we have Goodwin Avenue, which will replace the existing Chevy Chase crossing. That will be a new grade separation. And that's been coordinated with the local cities to try and find the solution that best fits the community. And then furthest on the south is the Main Street grade separation, where I mentioned we are crossing both the rail and the river. Another Metro project that we're coordinating on is the Doran grade separation project. So that is proposing a new grade separation at Salem Sperry to replace the current crossing at Doran. So I'll just move southerly to LA to Anaheim. This is kind of the overview talking about this section. We're approximately 30 miles long. There's 4 stations in this section. Michelle mentioned there's stations on both ends. Well, this one has 2 intermediate stops as well. Those are LA Union Station, Norwalk, Santa Fe Springs, then Fullerton, and on the south, the terminus of the whole Phase 1 system is in Anaheim at ARTIC. The 2 alternatives under study are the build and the no build. It's the same projects that we've been talking to you all before in past years. And it is another part of the shared urban corridor in this area. There's a lot more freight traffic than in the Burbank to LA section. This highlights the stations along the corridor, as I mentioned. Something to note is, they're existing stations, so we don't have to build a new one like we do in Burbank. So south from Union Station toward Vernon, again, we are coordinating with the Link Union Station project to connect with all the other rail back down into the existing corridor along the west bank of the LA River. We are at grade along the west bank all the way down to Vernon and actually use the existing Redondo Junction Bridge that is shown in blue on the map attached here. And then Malabar Yard is a project that is part of the high-speed rail to offset the current freight traffic along the corridor during construction and just to keep the corridor operating smoothly. Make sure that there's no conflicting movements. One more thing to note here is there is an existing BNSF yard that we're going to convert. We propose to convert to a high-speed rail light maintenance facility along the West Bank. So that'll take some of the freight off of this part of the corridor. Now moving from the Vernon Commerce area down to Montebello along the existing corridor. Again, we're in the same existing corridor. We are adding one new track. The majority of the corridor is 3 tracks, so we'll be adding another one, so it'll be similar scenario where there's 2 electrified and 2 non-electrified tracks within the corridor. This is an area where there are a lot of yards, existing yards. There's Hobart, Commerce, a lot of freight activity. So we are coordinating with the freights to, make sure that the modernizations planned there accommodate the high-speed rail alignments, and that everything is planned in collaboration to make the corridor operate as smooth as possible. To note, the existing Metrolink station at Commerce is proposed to be relocated to the south, right about at the border of Montebello and Commerce. We're hoping this will increase ridership. It takes it closer to the community and out of the yard area where it sits today. So this corridor is mostly at grade, but there is an elevated section through Commerce, again, to eliminate conflicts that kind of choke up the corridor. So this should help it operate, provide more service. South from Montebello to Fullerton, this is an area where the passenger corridor, the electrified tracks peel over to the east side of the alignment, and they're on an aerial viaduct as we go to the relocated Norwalk Santa Fe Springs station. So it will be in the same general area, but it has better geometry for the passenger trains. So it pulls the station a little easterly from where it sits today. Also, we come back down to the corridor just south of the proposed station relocation. One of the Metrolink stations here is Buena Park, and that one is also proposed to be relocated to the north. This is to accommodate construction of the corridor and, again, increase operations and relocate the station facilities to get them out of the way. This area is also mostly within the existing corridor. We'll cover grade separations in this area in a following slide. Now, once we get to Fullerton, this is where the freight corridor extends to the east, and we take a sharp right to go south to the ARTIC station. Fullerton Junction is a critical part of the project. We are proposing to make improvements there to modernize and also disentangle the freight and passenger traffic that slows down the corridor today. There's a lot of waiting on the corridor for trains to pass by, so this will address that issue. And the Fullerton station will remain intact as it is today, but just accommodate stops from high-speed rail with increased platform. And when we go south from Fullerton, there are 2 electrified tracks within the existing corridor. It's a lot narrower in this leg of the corridor versus the remainder of the proposed alignment. So that will also be at grade, and there are several grade separations proposed for Anaheim, a lot of at-grade crossings. And then easterly from Fullerton, there are additional studies or additional improvements that are under study that may be required to keep the corridor flowing. So you can see LA Anaheim has a lot of grade crossings. Because of the heavy traffic that exists today, most of them are already grade separated. So there are still 15 roads that cross at grade through the corridor. One to highlight is the Rosecrans Marquardt project. That's the number 3 project we're working on with Metro, and that one's further along than the remainder. The other grade crossings will either be modified, and when there's a lot that are modified, either just being electrified, adding electrification. The existing overcrossing will need to be widened and electrified, and there are some with the road underneath may need to be reprofiled. So there's various ways that these could be or will be proposed to be updated. And then there are 11 new grade separations proposed in the corridor. There are 3 in Santa Fe Springs, and then another 7 4 in Santa Fe Springs, and 7 in Anaheim. 23 will be modified. 2 of the crossings will remain at grade, where we're close to the terminus with additional safety measures. And then 3 are proposed to be closed for vehicular traffic with potentially a bike-ped connection. So aside from all of the track that's part of the proposed project, there are other features that are required to keep the train moving, and we have accounted for all of these in our environmental footprint and our environmental document. So these are the overhead contact systems, paralleling stations, the switching and communication stations. Those are spaced intermittently throughout the entire corridor, and we do account for those, as well as the maintenance facilities and maintenance of way that were discussed. There's a lot of yards, existing yards in the corridor that will require modernization. Now I'm going to call up Ali Mir to talk about the environmental process that we're in.
Good evening. So I'm going to provide you with an overview of where we are in the process. So we've heard a lot about the design itself and the steps that we're taking now to get the preferred alternative selected to move into the environmental phase. Starting with the first item, which is scoping. Scoping was a process that was initiated to engage all corridor cities and local jurisdictions, as well as community groups, to understand what are the environmental issues that are important to you that need to be evaluated. Based on that input, route concepts were developed, or alternatives, that basically looked end-to-end, including track configuration, station configuration. Those went through a refinement process based on community feedback, stakeholder feedback, as well as city feedback, and then environmental engineering was advanced on certain alternatives so that environmental decisions could be made. Where we are now is that this fall there will be a board meeting in Southern California for the staff state-recommended preferred alternatives to be selected for the Burbank to Los Angeles and Los Angeles to Anaheim sections. A less jargony way of saying that is the projects that are to be defined for environmental evaluation will be chosen. So the build alternatives for Burbank to LA and LA to Anaheim. And those are the projects that have been described in the slides previously. Based on the board action to accept the state staff recommended alternative, then the environmental documents will evaluate all of the effects associated with that. We'll be preparing draft environmental impact reports, which comply with the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, as well as draft environmental impact statement, which complies with the National Environmental Policy Act. Because this project is eligible for federal funding, we have to comply with both state and federal environmental requirements. We will analyze all of the environmental effects that are temporary in nature based on project construction, and all of the long-term operational effects associated with operating the project, and disclose those effects for anyone to review in the public draft EIR/EIS. And that will be an opportunity for anyone in this room, any jurisdiction, any community group, any public agency to provide specific comments on that draft environmental document. Now, if you write a comment letter and it's 10 pages long and you have 40 comments in it, I will respond to each individual comment. So all 40 comments in that 10-page letter will be responded to in the final EIR/EIS. It's not that we provide a blanket response to each comment letter, but each individual technical comment receives a response. And that's from members of the general public as well as public agencies. All of those comments and the responses to those comments are memorialized in what's called a final EIR/EIS. And even then, that goes back to the High-Speed Rail Authority Board for action. And so there's multiple opportunities for you to engage. At the board meeting where the state recommended preferred alternative will be recommended, which is in November in Southern California. Through the draft EIR/EIS process, you can provide written comments. There will be public meetings associated with that. You can provide comments at those meetings. And again, when the final EIR/EIS goes back to the board, you'll be able to provide comments there as well. And that's why this bar at the end indicates that there's multiple opportunities for public and stakeholder outreach and input. So what's in these environmental documents? Anything that you could see, hear, smell, or feel temporarily or permanently will be environmentally evaluated and cleared as a result of the project. So I think that's the easiest way to describe what we look at. So as you can see on the screen, aesthetics and visual quality, air quality, and it's important to note that this is based on temporary effects associated with project construction as well as long-term operational effects. Some of the questions that I was asked about today had to do with the LA River. How will evaluations of the LA River be handled? Has coordination occurred? So all of the coordination that has been occurring will also be memorialized in the document. So for the LA River, for example, we've been working very closely with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on their planned improvements, the City of LA on their planned improvements, and all of that will be memorialized in the document. And so for each of these environmental topics, it'll be split into temporary, construction-related effects, and long-term operational effects. So how do we do the analysis? This is the general philosophy or framework for environmental impact analysis as deployed by the High-Speed Rail Authority based on federal standards and state standards. Ideally, try to design a project that avoids an impact from occurring in the first place. So having a collaborative approach between the environmental team, the design team, the local jurisdictions, and the agencies with regulatory authority over the project to design a project that avoids impacts. And I think Melissa gave a great example with the G2 parcel. Initial design concepts clipped a portion of the G2 parcel. Through coordination with the City of LA, Friends of the LA River Conservancy, we were able to modify the design to preclude that impact from needing to occur. And so instead of proposing a project that caused an impact and then trying to mitigate it, we just modified the project itself to preclude that impact from occurring. In instances where that cannot happen, what can we do from a design and environmental perspective to minimize that effect? Either minimize the construction effect or minimize the long-term operational effect. Again, it's a collaborative approach between the environmental team, the design team, and the local jurisdictions. And finally, where we can't avoid the impact from occurring in the first place, the design features proposed don't minimize the effects. And one thing to mention on the minimization. The high-speed rail program has standardized IAMFs, impact avoidance and minimization features that are applied to all project sections. And so these are based on lessons learned from early environmental and design collaborations for the high-speed rail program, and those lessons learned are memorialized and pushed down to the project section level based on the history of the high-speed rail authority itself. In the event that the project design can't avoid the impact avoidance and minimization features are not effective, then finally we have to come up with mitigation measures. Those mitigation measures can be for temporary features or permanent features. An example of a mitigation measure is to reduce the speed in a particular location to decrease operational noise so that sensitive receptors like parks or schools don't hear the noise. That's just one example. So the next steps. The authority's board of directors is scheduled to identify the state's preferred alternative at a board meeting in Southern California in November. The federal NEPA processes encourage federal and state agencies to identify a preferred alternative before the release of the draft environmental document, which is the process that the state has decided to adopt. Staff recommends that the build alternative, which are the two alternatives described for Burbank to LA and LA to Anaheim in previous slides, as the alternatives to be considered for environmental evaluation because they meet the purpose and need, and obviously the no project alternative does not meet the purpose and need. Just a quick recap of what the state's preferred alternatives is for Burbank to LA. It's approximately 14 miles. The northern end is defined by the Burbank Airport Station below grade. The southern end is defined by Los Angeles Union Station. The track work includes a combination of below ground portion outside the rail corridor near Burbank Hollywood Station, Airport, and then at grade merged with existing Amtrak and Metrolink service for the remainder. It's a shared corridor with LOSSAN, Metrolink, Amtrak, and Union Pacific Railroad. And to the extent possible, as Melissa mentioned, we're trying to use the existing boundaries of the active railroad right-of-way and reconfiguring tracks to keep everyone that's currently using the corridor whole while allowing the introduction of electrified high-speed rail service, which would include adding 2 new electrified tracks southwest to share with passenger rail. Additional corridor changes, as mentioned, were 6 new grade separations, upgraded corridor protection, and 2 bridges over the LA River. The state's preferred alternative for LA to Anaheim is approximately 30 miles in length. Los Angeles Union Station at the northern end, Norwalk, Santa Fe Springs, and Fullerton stops, with the terminus being at ARTIC Station in Anaheim. Track work, approximately about 4 miles of elevated track through Redondo Junction at Commerce Yard in Santa Fe Springs, Norwalk, and approximately a mile of below grade around Fullerton Junction. The remainder is primarily at grade. Similar to Burbank to LA, we would be sharing the corridor with Metrolink, Amtrak, BNSF, and Union Pacific. Also similar to Burbank to LA, we're trying to use an active railroad corridor, rearrange the track work to reduce the amount of property takes that we need to reconfigure the right-of-way to allow for 4 mainline tracks, 2 of which would be electrified. There's 11 new grade separations, 23 modified grade separations, 3 roadway closures for vehicular traffic, which would be cul-de-sac, and 2 relocated Metrolink stations along the corridor.
Thanks, Ellie. All right, let me see if I could get through this last bit. So again, we've been up and down these corridors having meetings. This meeting marks the end of our meetings for the Burbank to Los Angeles corridor, but we still have 2 additional meetings for the Los Angeles to Anaheim corridor in Anaheim and Buena Park, and you can see the dates and information here on this slide. So in terms of the project's timeline or what's next, you can see here basically Los Angeles to Anaheim and Burbank to Los Angeles. They've been following a similar course of activity. From 2016 to 2018, we've been working on and advancing the range of alternatives for both of those projects. Here today, as Ali talked about and Melissa talked about, we are identifying, letting you know what we know about both of these routes and the route that should be selected as the state's preferred alternative based on what we, the staff, have discovered about it through our studies. And so it is the build alternative in both of these cases, as has been described. The next step would be for us to make a similar presentation to our board of directors, let them know what we know, and then they have an opportunity to give us direction to continue to move forward with these projects and prepare the environmental documents, the draft environmental documents, which will then be released after the board meeting. Those will be released sometime after the board meeting, depending again on the direction that we receive from our board. I'll take the questions at the end, but thank you. Based on the direction that we receive from the board, at those board meetings, the public also has an opportunity to address the board, to go talk to them about what we've talked to you about today. This board meeting will be held in the Southern California area, this particular one, which will be held in November when we make this presentation to our board on these 2 projects, will be in the San Fernando Valley. We're still finalizing the arrangements for that. But you can go address the board before the meeting starts and before we make the presentation to the board and receive their direction. After the preparation and release of the draft environmental documents, then we again take public comment and go through a specific hearing process, which we address all of those comments and wrap them up in final environmental documents, which then we present again to our board. And at that point, our board will certify that process. And at that point, that's when we can say, this is the project, this is the route the high-speed rail will take from this station to that station. So we still have a little bit to go. Today we have important information, but there's still ample opportunity for comment and feedback as we work towards the final identification of the project in this location. So I want to thank you guys very much, and now we will go into the question and answer.
Great. So we've received a few question cards from those of you here with us tonight in the audience. If you're watching from home, feel free to type it in and we will receive it and try to get through as many as we can. We're a little bit limited on time for Q&A live version because we will start the Spanish presentation at 7 o'clock, but the information stations around the room will be open till 7:30. So even for the folks here during the Spanish presentation, you are more than welcome to return to the stations and talk with our team to make sure all your questions are answered tonight. We're going to go ahead and start with more of a detailed question about the Main Street grade separation. So if we could talk a little bit about what we would expect during construction, the length of time it could take at Main Street, and maybe describe a little bit what the plan is for the grade separation.
I'll start and then I'll kick it over to Jerry. So at Main Street, if you're familiar, there's 2 sets of tracks on either side of the LA River. So it's a special grade separation, and it's a little bit more involved than a typical one. So we need to get at least 27 feet over the proposed tracks that are there today on a structure. So the street is proposed to go over the existing crossing and then join the corridor on either ends after that curve. As far as length for construction, I'll pass that.
First of all, we do have a concept available on that slides over there. But in general, construction for grade separation usually takes about 2 to 3 years, depending on the criteria required by the city or the community. For example, are we required to maintain traffic at all time, like 1 lane in each direction, or can we close it? Those are yet to be determined. One of the proposed concept here is we're actually maintaining the existing bridge pretty much throughout the entire. We're not looking to demolish it. So during construction, we are planning to maintain traffic at the existing Main Street while we build the main structure over the LA River. So this will allow us to minimize traffic at all times. So obviously the impact to different location will be different depending on how we face the project. But yeah.
Okay.
The one thing that I would like to say about the grade separations is this is a feature that greatly improves safety in the corridor, but this is one of the features that has the most impacts in the projects that we're planning, because we're planning to build additional rail within the existing railroad corridor, so there's not a lot of right-of-way impacts associated with that, but at these grade separation locations, there are impacts associated with them. And so we've been having conversations with folks up and down the corridor at these different grade separation locations. We are having a particular conversation about this Main Street grade separation location right now because it's very, very complicated to do, and we will continue that conversation as we move forward.
And just one more note on we had another question about the Main Street grade separation, if the zoning plan related to the Cornfield Arroyo Seco plan was considered.
A part of the environmental analysis is plan consistency, not just land use and zoning. And all of the plans that are being proposed and from a design perspective for the Main Street grade separation are being coordinated with the City of LA. So the 2 things that I would say is that the designs would be in coordination with City of LA, and the environmental document, if there is a zoning plan or any plan inconsistency, would be described in the land use and planning chapter of the EIR/EIS. But as was mentioned, analysis is still underway. We still need to get the state recommended preferred alternative first before environmental impact determinations are made.
We're going to jump ahead a little bit, and there's some questions about construction. When will construction begin for Burbank, LA? Is any of the project under construction? When will the line open?
So our plan right now is to have high-speed rail service from San Francisco to Anaheim operational in 2033. So we begin to work backward. The first construction you will see for Burbank to LA will be the construction on the Link Us project. That construction, when that starts in a couple of years, will mark basically the first construction of high-speed rail for that corridor. For the high-speed rail Los Angeles to Anaheim project, that Rosecrans Marquardt project will be under construction in a couple of years, and that will mark the first construction for high-speed rail in these corridors. Our construction then, as we come in later, probably several years away until we start the full corridor construction.
Great. And can you also talk a little bit about Metrolink capacity and how that is impacted by the Burbank-Anaheim sections?
Metrolink capacity should be able to increase with the plan that we have today. We've done a lot of operational analysis about how we can run those trains more efficiently in that corridor. That modernization that we're talking about with regards to sealing the corridor and improving the signal system will allow us to operate more trains in these corridors. So Metrolink service should increase. LOSSAN's service should expand over a broader window, and high-speed rail service should be able to be introduced. We can do all of those things with this corridor if we operate it as a modern corridor.
Great. And then shifting a little bit from the sections we're talking about tonight, could you talk a little bit about Phase 2, the LA-San Diego route, and why it's traveling through the Inland Empire?
So we've very trickily named our project Phase 1 and Phase 2. So obviously Phase 2, we're working on a little bit slower pace. And we are in preliminary planning right now. Based on what we see in terms of ridership demand, that is an important connection for the state of California. That is an important connection for Southern California. We have some of the highest ridership in the Metrolink system right now on the San Bernardino line, so there's a lot of demand for movement. Picture in your mind the I-10, there's never traffic on that, right? So that's why we're planning that, but ultimately that Phase 2 section, that Los Angeles to San Diego through the Inland Empire, also becomes a future connection to Phoenix. So we're also looking at those types of future connections we'd like to make. Of course, our Palmdale to Burbank section has another exciting connection right up in Palmdale that could be a future connection to Nevada and Las Vegas. So we're really thinking very, very big picture when we're looking at what we're doing.
Great. We received a couple of questions from our online viewers. The first is going to talk about electrification and shared use, and then there's also a question about the Goodwin grade separation. So starting with electrification, if Metrolink should introduce electric service like Caltrans, can it share the same electric tracks as high-speed rail?
We are actually planning the urban section right now from Burbank to Los Angeles to Anaheim for Metrolink to share our tracks, even without electrification. We are building this so that the Metrolink trains can operate on the same tracks that have the electrification that high-speed rail will operate on. That is why we can get these service advantages that we've been talking about. If Metrolink electrifies someday, absolutely they can use our electrification system.
And if someday a Metrolink electrified, could electrified Metrolink share the high-speed rail yard?
Absolutely. All of the work that we're doing in this urban corridor, we are focused on making sure that it's completely interoperable. So there's nothing we're building that is completely exclusive to any one user.
Okay. Shifting gears to the Goodwin grade separation, is that a final decision for the proposed plan? And is it in the state's preferred alternative from LA to Burbank, or Burbank to Los Angeles?
Yeah, it's currently in the state's preferred. As Michelle mentioned, the project isn't the project until the end of the environmental process. So right now it's being carried as part of the project at Goodwin, but we're not at the final project yet, but it's currently proposed. And if you want more detail on that particular crossing, I'll echo what Jerry said, is that we've got exhibits at the stations to show those.
Okay. And does the authority understand that the 2033 completion date undermines public trust in the project?
We continue to try to get this project completed as soon as we can. That's why we have identified opening that valley-to-valley line and getting these trains operating. We have also, if you take a look at our business plan, put a particular focus on the urban corridor down here, and we will be working as hard as we can to get those improvements continuing. We have two right on deck, Link, us, and Rosecrans Marquardt. We will look for every opportunity to keep adding to that list until we can introduce high-speed rail here, because we understand that we are throwing some parties over the course of the next decade, right? We've got Super Bowl coming, we've got a World Cup coming, we've got the Olympics coming, and if you take a look at where those venues are planned and you take a look at this rail corridor, it would be able to provide very seamless service for that. And so we will do whatever we can, and it's difficult, but we will continue to work towards getting high-speed rail operational as soon as we can.
Great. And our final question for this part of the session is, earlier on there was discussion of public-private partnership. What's the level of private sector interest right now, and are there any potential ways they could be motivated to support the project?
So we regularly have private companies come in and talk with us about the project. Several years ago, we asked for people to express interest, and they expressed interest. But one of the things that they said is, we need to know what the project is. We need to know what you plan to build. That's where we're working, what we're working towards today is that route selection. Once we make that route selection and we let people know what we're planning to do and what the cost of that is, that's when the private sector will get much more interested and involved in the project. We have hired an advisor from Europe to be helping us work on this. Our early train operator is looking at opportunities for this as well. So we have put into place basically, and are putting into place, the steps that we need to take to make sure that we do have a very productive conversation with the private sector.
We are at our 7 o'clock mark, and we've committed to starting our Spanish presentation at 7 o'clock for our audience here, but also our folks watching from home, the webcast. We do have a couple questions that we weren't able to get through in this Q&A session, so if you'd like to come and see us to the side, we'd be happy to address them and chat with you about those. For our online viewer who did submit a question after we announced our last question, please make sure you leave your email, and we will definitely contact you to follow up on your question about electrification from Chatsworth South. So thank you for your time tonight.